The day Victor Hawthorne rode onto Cole Mercer's land, he didn't bother announcing himself. He simply dismounted at the front gate, walked past the hired hands like they were fence posts, and stopped 3 feet from Abigail Rowan Mercer with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "You should tell your husband," he said, loud enough for every hand within earshot to hear, "that a woman who can't read a deed has no business pretending to run one." He dropped a folded paper at her feet. Not into her hands, at her feet. Then he turned around and rode away. Abigail stood in the morning dust and didn't move for a long moment. Around her, men she had worked alongside for months suddenly found things to look at on the ground. Nobody picked up the paper for her. Nobody said a word. She bent down and picked it up herself. That was the day Abigail understood what kind of war she was already in, and that she had been in it from the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. If you're watching this story and wondering what you would have done in her place, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single episode of this journey, because what Abigail does next will surprise you. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach from Abilene took 3 days, and by the time it rolled into the town of Harrow Creek, Abigail Rowan had eaten the last of her bread somewhere around the second morning and had been too proud to say anything about it. She was 22 years old. She had $31 folded into the lining of her coat, a carpet bag with a broken clasp, and a letter from a man named Cole Mercer that she had read so many times the creases were beginning to tear. The letter was not romantic. It was methodical. A list of what he expected, what he offered in return, and a single sentence at the end that she had spent more time thinking about than everything else combined. "I am not an easy man to live with, but I am an honest one." She had decided that was enough. What she hadn't decided and hadn't been able to prepare for was the moment the stagecoach door opened and she climbed out in front of the Harrow Creek General Store and realized that half the town was already watching. Not the polite kind of watching, the kind where people lean toward each other and don't bother lowering their voices. She heard the word desperate before she'd taken 3 steps. A woman in a yellow dress standing outside the dry goods store said something to the woman beside her, and they both looked at Abigail with the specific expression of people who have already made up their minds. The woman in yellow was maybe 40, handsome in a hard way, wearing a hat that cost more than Abigail's entire bag. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. The way the other women deferred to her said everything. Abigail set her carpet bag on the ground and looked for the man who was supposed to meet her. Cole Mercer was not there. What was there was a boy of about 16, rope-thin and sunburned, holding a sign with her name written on it in letters that had clearly been a struggle. He looked relieved to see her in a way that made her think he'd been standing there a while. "Miss Rowan?" He pulled off his hat. "Mr. Mercer sends his apologies. There was a problem with the south herd this morning. He said to bring you out to the ranch and he'd be back by supper." Abigail picked up her bag. "All right. I'm Jessie. I help with the horses mostly." "Nice to meet you, Jessie." The woman in the yellow dress called out across the distance between them, not quite shouting, not quite not. "Jessie, you make sure to tell Mr. Mercer that Margaret Holt sends her regards to his new arrangement." She said the word arrangement the way some people said mistake. Abigail didn't turn around. She climbed up onto the wagon seat next to Jessie, and Jessie flicked the reins, and they rode out of Harrow Creek with the sound of at least 2 women laughing somewhere behind them. Jessie didn't say anything for a while, then, "That's Mrs. Holt. Her husband and Mr. Mercer do business sometimes. She's always been like that." She's not. Most people aren't like her." "Jessie." "Ma'am?" "You don't have to explain her to me." He looked sideways at her. Then he nodded, and they rode the rest of the way in a more comfortable quiet. The Mercer Ranch was bigger than she'd imagined. The letter had said thousands of acres, and she'd read those words. But reading them and then cresting a rise and seeing the actual land spread out before you, pasture land and creek breaks and cattle dotting the distance in every direction, was something else entirely. The main house was large without being extravagant, built from timber and stone, the kind of structure that had been added onto over years rather than planned all at once. It looked like what it was, a working place. A man was waiting on the porch when they pulled up. Not Cole. She would learn that soon enough. This man was older, maybe 55, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that moved over her the way a livestock buyer assessed an animal at auction. "Hector Dills," he said. He didn't offer his hand. "I'm the foreman. Been running operations here 11 years. "Abigail Rowan." She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for Jesse to help. "I look forward to learning how things work." Something shifted in Dills's expression. Not hostility, or not just hostility. Something closer to calculation. "Mr. Mercer runs a tight operation," he said. "Things work the way they work because that's how he wants them." "I understand. A lot of women come out here thinking they're going to—" He stopped, started differently. "There's a room ready for you in the house. Supper's at 6. He walked away before she could respond. Jesse appeared at her elbow, quiet as a cat. "He's not usually friendly." "I noticed. It's not personal." She looked at him. "Jesse, I think it might actually be a little personal." He thought about it. "Yeah," he admitted. "Maybe a little." Cole Mercer came back at 5:30, which was close enough to supper that the distinction barely mattered. Abigail heard the horses before she saw him. A group of riders coming in hard from the south field, the kind of riding that meant something had gone wrong and the day had been spent managing it. She was standing in the kitchen, having spent the afternoon exploring the house with the careful, cataloging attention of someone who understood she was trying to learn a new language. The kitchen was the room that told her the most. The stores were poorly organized, supplies mixed together without logic, staples running low while less essential goods sat in excess. She'd found a bag of cornmeal with weevils she'd have to get rid of. She'd found a ledger tucked behind a flour jar that she hadn't opened. She heard boots on the porch steps and put the ledger back where she'd found it. Cole Mercer came through the door and stopped when he saw her. He was taller than she'd expected, not a large man in the way that some men used their size as a kind of announcement, but solid, built from years of physical work, with the kind of stillness that came from having made a lot of decisions in difficult circumstances. He was maybe 34, 35. His face was the kind that had been good-looking before it got hard, and it had gotten hard some time ago. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at a lot of things, directly and without a great deal of expression. "Miss Rowan." "Mr. Mercer." A silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. "I apologize for not meeting the stage. There was a problem with the south pasture fence. 40 head got loose and we spent the day—" He stopped. "You don't need the full account." "I don't mind the full account." He looked at her again. Something in his face shifted slightly, though she couldn't have said toward what. "The fence was cut," he said. "Not broken. Cut. 3rd time this season." She let that sit for a moment. "That's not a maintenance problem." "No," he said. "It's not." The cook, a woman named Dora, who was compact and efficient and had greeted Abigail with exactly one nod and nothing else, set a pot on the table. Other hands began coming in through the back. The meal that followed was not a warm one. 7 men sat around the long table, and Abigail sat at Cole's right hand, and nobody spoke to her directly except Jesse, who passed her the bread with a kind of deliberate pointedness, like he was making a statement. Hector Dills sat across from her and ate without looking up. After supper, Cole asked her to come into the main room. He stood at the window that faced south, and she stood a few feet back, and he said without turning around, "The marriage terms I sent in my letter, I want to make sure they were clear." "They were clear. This isn't something I—" He stopped, tried again. "I've been told I'm not easy to live with." "You said so in your letter." He turned then. She thought she saw something that might have been surprise. "I'm not here for easy," she said. "I had easy. Easy was being 17 and watching my parents get buried in the same year and then watching my uncle sell the house they'd built. Easy didn't do much for me." Something changed in his face. Not softening. Cole Mercer didn't soften. She would come to understand that. But something settled, like a door that had been held partly closed, finally making up its mind. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. That was the closest thing to a wedding vow they ever exchanged. The first 2 weeks, she learned to stay in her lane. That was what survival on the Mercer Ranch required in those early days. knowing which spaces were hers and which were not, and not making the mistake of reaching into someone else's territory before she had any standing to do it. Dills made the foreman's position clear early. He managed the hands, the schedules, the cattle operations, the supply orders. He'd been doing it for 11 years, and he intended to keep doing it for 11 more. And any woman who showed up thinking she was going to insert herself into that structure was going to find the structure uninterested in her opinion. She didn't argue with him. She watched. She watched Dills send Jesse and 2 other young hands out to repair fence line on the east pasture 3 mornings in a row, pulling them away from the vegetable plot that was supposed to be producing winter stores. She watched him order double the usual grain delivery from a supplier 2 towns over when there was a perfectly adequate supplier a half-day's ride away. She watched a ranch hand named Pruitt disappear to the supply shed every evening for about 20 minutes longer than any task in there required. She didn't say anything to anyone about what she noticed. She introduced herself to Dora and asked if she could help with the canning, and Dora said she didn't need help but didn't say Abigail couldn't be in the kitchen. And so Abigail spent a week learning the rhythms of the house while keeping her mouth shut and her eyes open. Dora wasn't cruel, she was territorial in the way of a woman who had maintained her position through relentless competence, and she had no particular reason to trust that this newcomer wouldn't make more work for her. By the end of the second week, Abigail asked Dora if she could take a look at the kitchen ledger. Dora set down her knife. Why? Because the weevils in the cornmeal tell me the store rotation isn't working, and I'd rather fix it quietly than have to explain a shortage to Mr. Mercer come November. Dora looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the cabinet where the ledger was kept. Not the one Abigail had already found, but a second one, and handed it over without a word. That second ledger was where things began to get interesting. The numbers were off. Not dramatically, not in a way that would catch someone's eye during a casual review, but she'd grown up watching her mother keep the household accounts with the careful precision of a woman who knew exactly how little margin they had. And that kind of training didn't leave you. The supply costs were consistently about 8 to 12% higher than they should have been given the quantities delivered. The grain overage, the split between what was being ordered and what was actually appearing in the stores. Someone was skimming. She put the ledger back and didn't say anything yet. She needed more information before she said anything, and she needed to be right because the only thing worse than finding out someone was stealing from Cole Mercer would be accusing the wrong person and losing whatever thin ground she'd managed to gain. It was during this period that she first crossed paths with Victor Hawthorne. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon unannounced, riding with 2 other men who positioned themselves slightly behind him, in the particular way of men who were paid to be present rather than to participate. He was maybe 50, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of groomed handsomeness that required money and time and a certain willingness to spend both on yourself. He owned the Hawthorne Crossing Ranch to the west, which was substantial, and the Dunmore grazing lease to the north, which was disputed, and he had a reputation in Harrow Creek for being generous and charming and for getting what he wanted in the end. Cole met him in the yard. Abigail watched from the kitchen window. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read the shape of it. Cole stood with his arms loose at his sides, the posture of a man who was not impressed but was being civil because civility cost nothing. Hawthorne talked with his hands, expansive gestures, the performance of a man who believed he was being persuasive. At some point, Hawthorne glanced toward the house, directly at the window, directly at her. He smiled. It was a pleasant smile. That was what made it unpleasant. Cole came in afterward and said only that Hawthorne had made an offer on the south pasture land and that he had declined. Has he made offers before? She asked. Cole looked at her. Twice. Both times no. Does he accept no? The pause before his answer was the answer. He usually finds another way to get what he wants. She thought about the cut fence lines. She thought about the ledger. She didn't say anything yet because she still didn't have enough. The thing about learning a new place is that the place teaches you in its own time, and there's nothing you can do to rush it. Abigail had understood this in theory. Living it was different. She made mistakes. She reorganized the root cellar without telling Dora, and Dora spent 20 minutes looking for the turnips before finding them in the new location, and the look she gave Abigail communicated a volume of feeling without a single word. Abigail apologized and explained her logic, and Dora said nothing but stopped turning her back on her quite so definitively. She asked Hector Dills about the abandoned East Field, 20 acres that had clearly once been productive and had been left to go to scrub. And Dills told her it wasn't worth the water cost to revive it, and when she suggested that a rotation system might reduce the water dependency, he looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has just told him how to do a job he has been doing for 11 years. "With respect, Mrs. Mercer," he said, and the "with respect" was doing a lot of work in that sentence. "The East Field is not a kitchen garden." She let it go. She went and looked at the East Field herself, walked the irrigation lines that were still there, still functional, just unused. She dug up a handful of soil and looked at it and put it back. She had grown up on a farm. Not a large one, not a prosperous one, but her father had believed in working the land with attention, and attention was what she'd inherited from him, if nothing else. The East Field was not dead. It was resting. She started working it on her own time, early mornings before the rest of the house was fully awake. Jesse found her there on the third morning and stood at the edge looking at what she'd done. "Does Mr. Mercer know you're doing this?" he asked. "Not yet." "Does Dills know?" "Also not yet." Jesse thought about this. "Can I help?" She looked at him. This boy who had been the first person in Harrow Creek to treat her like a regular human being, who passed her the bread at dinner like it mattered. "Yes," she said, "but you have to do it on your own time, and if Dills asks you about it, you tell him the truth." "And what's the truth?" "That Mrs. Mercer asked you to help her with the East Field, and you said yes because you thought it was a good idea." He grinned. It made him look even younger. "Okay." Cole found out about the East Field 2 weeks later when he rode past it and noticed it wasn't scrub anymore. He came in at supper and sat down and looked at her for a long moment before he said anything. "The East Field." "Yes." "Dills told me it wasn't worth the water cost." "The south irrigation line has capacity that isn't being used. Diverting it costs about a third of what putting in new lines would." "How do you know about the south irrigation line?" "I walked it." Another pause. The rest of the table was very quiet. Even Dills had gone still, though his face was doing something complicated. "The soil composition in that section is good," she continued, because she'd started and there was no point in stopping. "If we plant winter wheat in the eastern third and let the rest go to pasture rotation, we reduce the grain purchase cost by roughly 40% for the next season." Cole looked at her, then he looked at Hector Dills. Dills's jaw was tight. "We'd need to pull hands from the main herd to work it." "Jesse and I have been working it on our own time," Abigail said. "We'd need 2 more hands for about 3 weeks to get the wheat in. After that, it runs itself until spring." The silence that followed was the kind that had a lot of different feelings inside it. Cole said, "Do it." Dills put down his fork. He picked it up again. He didn't say a word. That was the night Abigail understood that she had made a real enemy in Hector Dills, and that this was not going to get easier before it got harder. But she also understood something else, the way Cole had looked at her across the table when he said those 2 words. Not with admiration exactly, with something more cautious than that, and more valuable. He was paying attention. She found the proof about the supply skimming 3 weeks after the East Field decision, and when she found it, it was worse than she'd thought. It wasn't just Pruitt in the supply shed, it was a system. Pruitt taking inventory, Dills ordering, a man named Garrett at the supply company in the next town receiving the orders and logging quantities that were 10 to 15% higher than what was actually delivered, with the difference split between Garrett and someone on the ranch end. The second ranch ledger, the one Dora had given her, showed the pattern clearly once she knew what she was looking at. She sat with it for 2 days. This was the part that kept her up at night, because the evidence pointed at Dills, and Dills had been with Cole for 11 years, and whatever their working relationship had become in recent weeks, she had no reason to think Cole trusted her over a man who had stood beside him for over a decade. She could be wrong. She could have misread the numbers. She could be walking into the worst situation she'd yet created for herself. Or she could be right, and the longer she waited, the more it cost. On the 3rd day, she went to Cole's office and knocked on the door and waited until he told her to come in. And then she put the ledger on his desk and stood across from him and walked him through exactly what she'd found. He didn't say anything while she talked. His face didn't change. When she finished, he looked at the ledger for a long time without touching it. "How long?" he finally said. The pattern in the ledger goes back about 2 years. Could be longer. He was quiet. I might be wrong, she said, because she thought she should. You're not wrong. His voice was flat, not angry, something past anger or before it. I've had a feeling about the supply costs for a year. He stopped. I didn't look at it hard enough. She didn't say anything. Why did you come to me with this instead of going to Dill's directly? Because if I'm wrong, I need you to know I brought it to you straight. And if I'm right, it's not my call to make. He looked at her then, not the careful measuring look of the past weeks. Something different, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time and wasn't quite sure what to do with what he saw. All right, he said. Dill's was gone within a week. Cole handled it quietly, without public drama, which was his way. Pruitt followed 2 days later. Cole hired a new foreman from a neighboring county, a man named Walsh, who was competent and straightforward and had no existing relationship with anyone at Harrow Creek. The night after Dill's left, Cole came into the kitchen where Abigail was going over the supply accounts with the new system she'd put together. He didn't say much. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter and watched her work for a moment. You've been going over those since morning, he said. I want to make sure I haven't missed anything. Have you? She looked up. Not yet. He nodded slowly. Something in his posture was different. Some tension she'd gotten so used to she'd stopped noticing it had shifted slightly. Not gone, but different. Abigail. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. Just that. And then he went back to his office. She sat for a moment after he left, and then she turned back to the ledger, and she worked until the lamp burned low. Outside, the night sounds of the frontier settled around the house. The distant movement of cattle, the wind across the pasture, the ordinary sounds of a place that was beginning, slowly and without announcement, to feel something like hers. She was not happy yet. She was not secure. She was not trusted fully, and she was not loved, and there were people in Harrow Creek who had decided what she was and were not going to change their minds based on anything as inconvenient as evidence. But she had found the skimming, and she had brought it forward, and Cole Mercer had said her name. That was enough for tonight. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. Walsh showed up on a Monday with a bedroll, a spare horse, and exactly no opinions about how things had been done before he got there, which was the quality Cole had hired him for above everything else. He was 40-something, lean, with a quiet efficiency that reminded Abigail of her father in certain lights. The kind of man who assessed a situation by watching it first and talking second. He spent his first 3 days on the ranch mostly listening. He asked questions about the herd rotation, the water access, the supply lines. He didn't ask about Dills. He didn't ask about Abigail. He treated her with the same straightforward neutrality he treated everyone else, which, after weeks of Dills's bristling resentment, felt like a minor luxury. The ranch hands took their time forming an opinion about him. Some of them had liked Dills, or had been loyal to him in the specific way of men who benefit from the particular disorder a dishonest foreman creates. Those men watched Walsh with a careful, closed-off watchfulness. Others, like Jesse, seemed simply relieved that the temperature in the yard had dropped. Abigail kept her head down and her hands busy. The Eastfield wheat was in and doing what she'd told Cole it would do. The kitchen stores were reorganized, rotated correctly, the weevil problem resolved. She'd started a small kitchen garden on the south side of the house. Nothing elaborate, just herbs and root vegetables that reduced what they needed to purchase through winter. And Dora had stopped pretending not to notice it, and had begun, quietly and without comment, using what it produced. It wasn't peace, exactly, but it was a workable arrangement, and workable arrangements were something Abigail had learned to value. The problem was Victor Hawthorne. Cole had not mentioned him since the afternoon he'd turned down the offer on the south pasture, but Hawthorne's name came up in other conversations, in the way that a weather system comes up when people are watching the horizon. He was the largest landowner in the county by some measurements, second largest by others, depending on which of his boundary disputes you chose to count as settled. He had relationships with the county commissioners. He had relationships with the Territorial Land Office. He had a lawyer named Slade who rode into Harrow Creek twice a month from the county seat, and whenever Slade appeared, something in the town's social geometry shifted slightly. the way furniture shifts when someone large enters a room. Abigail learned this from Margaret Holt, which was not how she would have chosen to learn anything, but information was information regardless of its source. Margaret Holt came to the ranch on a Wednesday in late October, unannounced, in a buggy driven by her husband Frank, who was a round-faced, agreeable man who clearly spent a good deal of his energy not being in Margaret's way. She said she'd come to welcome Abigail properly now that she'd had time to settle in. The visit had the flavor of a reconnaissance mission dressed up as social courtesy. She sat in the front room with a cup of tea that Dora made under visible protest, and she talked about Harrow Creek the way a person talks about territory they consider theirs, with proprietary detail, a steady awareness of who had what position, and the specific pleasure of delivering information that made the recipient understand how much they didn't yet know. "Victor Hawthorne threw a dinner last month," Margaret said, arranging her skirt. "Lovely evening. He has wonderful taste for a man who built everything himself." She glanced at Abigail. "He asked after you, actually. He'd heard Cole had married." "That's kind." "He's a very attentive man." A pause shaped to carry weight. "He pays attention to what's happening around him, in the county, on neighboring properties." Abigail set down her tea. "Mrs. Holt, I appreciate you coming out. Can I ask you something directly?" Margaret's eyes sharpened with interest. "Of course. Is there something you're trying to tell me, or are you testing to see how much I already know?" A beat of silence. Frank across the room seemed to find something very interesting to examine on the wall. Margaret looked at Abigail for a long moment. Then, for the first time since the stagecoach, she smiled with something that might have been genuine. "Both," she said. "It was not the beginning of a friendship, but it was the beginning of an understanding, which was, Abigail was coming to learn, often more useful." What Margaret told her, in the careful, indirect language of a woman who had navigated the county's social structures for 20 years, was this. Hawthorne had been pursuing Mercer land for a long time. The South Pasture offer was not the first and was unlikely to be the last. He had a particular interest in the creek access that ran along the Mercer property's western edge, because whoever controlled that water access controlled the viability of 3 smaller ranches that sat between the 2 large operations, and Hawthorne had plans for those 3 ranches that involved them eventually becoming part of his own holdings. "Cole has resisted every approach," Margaret said, "which Victor respects in his way. He doesn't respect people who fold too easily." Another calculated pause. "But he's not accustomed to being told no indefinitely." After they left, Abigail stood at the window and thought about cut fence lines, about doubled grain orders that benefited a supplier one town over, about the fact that Dills had been on the Mercer payroll for 11 years, and if Hawthorne had been working toward Mercer land for nearly that long, the math of that was uncomfortable. She didn't say anything to Cole yet. She was still building the picture. And she'd learned, in the months since her arrival, that Cole's patience with incomplete information was limited. He was a man who, once presented with a problem, wanted to act on it immediately. If she brought him half a theory, he'd want to move before she had the ground under it. She needed the whole thing first. November came in cold and dry, and the first hard frost took everyone slightly by surprise except Walsh, who had apparently been watching the sky for it and had already moved the more vulnerable stock to the south shelter 2 days before. He mentioned it to Cole without fanfare, and Cole nodded, and that was the entirety of the acknowledgement, which seemed to suit Walsh perfectly well. The winter wheat in the east field had germinated. Abigail walked it in the early mornings sometimes, not because there was anything to do yet, but because she liked to see it. The thin green lines emerging from the soil were one of the few things in her current life that were entirely unambiguous. They were either growing or they weren't, and they were growing. Jesse found her there one morning when the frost was still hard on the ground, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "Mrs. Mercer." He fell into step beside her in the easy way he'd developed over the months, as if he'd always known her. "Walsh wants to talk to you about the irrigation schedule before the ground freezes solid." "I'll find him after breakfast." They walked a bit. The field ran out ahead of them, the green lines orderly and stubborn. "Can I ask you something?" Jesse said. "You always ask that, and I always say yes." "What happens if it doesn't work? The wheat? What if the yield's not what you said?" She considered the question. It was a good one. Jesse asked good questions when he trusted the person he was asking. Then I was wrong, she said, and I'll say so. He was quiet for a moment. Dills would have never said that. If something went wrong, it was always something else's fault. The weather, the hands, the season. I know. How come you're different? She looked at the wheat. Because I've been wrong enough times to know that pretending you weren't just makes it harder to fix. He thought about this with the visible, earnest concentration of someone 17 years old who is genuinely filing information away. Okay, he said finally. Okay, she agreed. The irrigation conversation with Walsh led to a longer conversation about the spring planting schedule, which led to a conversation about the fence line repair that had been deferred since summer, which led to Walsh making a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated a considered opinion about the state of the eastern boundary posts. How bad? She asked. Bad enough that the next time someone cuts them, there won't be much to cut. She looked at him. You know about the fence cutting. I know everything that's been happening on this property since I got here, Walsh said, and enough of what happened before. What do you think about it? Walsh was a man who did not answer questions before he was ready to. He picked up one of the weakened posts, turned it in his hands, set it back down. I think the fences being cut on the western boundary specifically is worth noticing, he said. The western boundary runs along the creek access. She had not told Walsh about her conversation with Margaret Holt. She had not mentioned the creek access to anyone. How long have you known that? She asked. Since I walked the property lines in my first week. He looked at her steadily. I notice you're not surprised. I'm not. Does Mr. Mercer know? He knows about the fence cutting. He may or may not have connected it to the specific location pattern. Walsh replaced the post in his hands and picked up the next one. It might be worth connecting it for him. Yes, she said. It might. She brought it to Cole that evening after supper, when the house was quiet and the hands had settled into the bunkhouse for the night. She sat across from him in his office and laid out what she had. The fence locations mapped against the western boundary, the creek access, Margaret's information about Hawthorne's interest in the water rights, and Walsh's observation about the pattern. Cole listened the way he always listened, still, without interruption, his face giving almost nothing away. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder if she'd overstepped. Then he said, The creek access feeds the Dunmore lease to the north, which Hawthorne already controls. If he gets the western boundary water rights from Mercer land, he controls the full creek corridor. Cole's jaw was tight. The three small operations between us and the Dunmore lease would be entirely dependent on Hawthorne water to survive. And dependent means negotiable, or means sold. He stood up, moved to the window. I've been thinking about this as harassment, as a man trying to wear me down until I sell. It might be that too. But it's also infrastructure. He's been building something. For a while, she said carefully. The fence cutting started before Walsh got here, before I got here. She let that sit without adding anything to it. Cole was a smart man. He didn't need her to draw the line between Dills and Hawthorne out loud. He stood at the window for a moment. Then he turned around and looked at her with an expression she hadn't quite seen on him before. Something tired and something else. Something that might have been the kind of anger that comes not from being surprised, but from having the confirmation of something you'd been half afraid to look at directly. How long have you been putting this together? He asked. Since Margaret Holt came to the ranch. That was 6 weeks ago. I needed to be sure before I brought it to you. He looked at her a long time. You keep doing that, making sure before you say anything. I've seen what happens when people say things they're not sure about. It tends to make everything harder. Something shifted in his face again. That thing that was not quite softening, but that she'd learned to recognize as Cole's version of it. He sat back down and pulled a piece of paper toward him. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning. They were there for 2 hours. She told him everything she had, and he asked questions that were sharp and specific, and revealed that he'd been thinking about related pieces of this problem on his own, from different angles. And by the time they were done, the picture they'd assembled together was clearer and more complete than either of them had had alone. At some point, Dora left a pot of coffee outside the office door without knocking. Abigail noticed it and brought it in without saying anything about it, and Cole poured himself a cup without saying anything about it either, and they went on talking. It was the first time she felt like they were actually on the same side of something. December brought the county's winter social, an event at the Harrow Creek Community Hall that functioned as a combination of a genuine social occasion, an informal political gathering, and a prolonged performance of who stood where in the county hierarchy. Cole didn't attend these things as a rule. He told Abigail this 3 days before the event, in the tone of a man who considered the matter settled. "I think we should go," she said. He looked at her. "Victor Hawthorne will be there," she said. "He'll be watching who comes and who stays away. If we stay away, it reads as, I don't care what it reads as to Hawthorne." "Cole," she said it quietly, not as a challenge. "I'm not suggesting we perform anything for him. I'm suggesting that the people in that room are the same people who sit on the county commission and sign off on land disputes and water rights decisions. And right now, most of them know me as the girl from the stagecoach that Margaret Holt talked about." He was quiet. "Let them know me as something else," she said. They went. The community hall was warm with bodies and lamplight, and the competing energies of people who only gather in large groups a few times a year. Abigail wore the best dress she owned, which was not very grand, but she'd pressed it carefully and done her hair simply, and stood beside Cole at the door with the composure of someone who had decided, before they arrived, exactly what kind of evening this was going to be. Victor Hawthorne was across the room when they walked in. He looked up the moment they entered. The room was large enough that she wouldn't have expected him to notice immediately, but he did, which told her something about how carefully he watched for the Mercers. He smiled and raised a glass in their direction. Cole nodded once, barely, and steered them toward the far side of the room. The evening proceeded in layers. There were conversations that were purely social and pleasant and had nothing to do with anything. There were conversations that were social on the surface and something else underneath, and those were the ones Abigail paid closest attention to. She met Commissioner Aldrich, who was 60 and careful with his words, and shook her hand with the measured warmth of a man who never expressed an opinion before he had to. She met the wife of the county registrar, who was warm and direct, and had grown up farming and recognized another farming background when she saw one, and talked to Abigail for 20 minutes about winter wheat yields in a way that felt entirely genuine. Hawthorne made his approach midway through the evening. He came alone, without his usual flanking presence, which meant he wanted to seem unthreatening. He was good at this, good at calibrating the version of himself he presented to each situation. He shook Cole's hand with the ease of two men who understood their relationship to each other without needing to discuss it. Then he turned to Abigail. "Mrs. Mercer, I've been hoping for a proper introduction." His smile was practiced and warm, and she recognized it now for what it was, a tool, like any other. "Victor Hawthorne, I'm afraid I've been remiss in welcoming you to the county." "Not at all," she said pleasantly. "You dropped a paper at my feet in October." The smile didn't flicker. He was better than that, but something in his eyes recalculated. "I was hoping that introduction might be forgotten." "I have a good memory." "So I'm told." He glanced between the two of them with the comfortable assessment of a man who believed he understood the situation. "I hope you're finding the ranch agreeable. It's a challenging operation to come into." "I've enjoyed learning it." Cole's built something impressive, whatever else one might say. He said whatever else with the lightness of a man dropping a suggestion he doesn't intend to pursue, so you can't call him on it. "I hope whatever difficulties the property has had recently haven't made things too discouraging." "What difficulties?" she asked. His eyes moved to her. "I'd heard about some fence trouble and supply issues. These things happen." "They do," she agreed. "And then you figure out why they happened and you deal with it." A beat, very small, but she caught it. "Well," he said, "I'm glad to hear it." He turned back to Cole. "The offer on the south pasture remains open whenever you're ready to revisit it." "It doesn't," Cole said. Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Of course." He lifted his glass slightly. "Enjoy the evening." He walked away. Cole was still beside her, his posture unchanged, his face closed. "He knows we know something," Abigail said quietly, not moving. "Yes." "He'll move faster now." "Yes." She watched Hawthorne rejoin a group near the far end of the room that included Commissioner Aldrich and the county surveyor and a man she didn't recognize who had the look of a lawyer. "We need to document everything," she said. "Every fence repair, every incident, every supply discrepancy from the Dills period, written down, dated, witnessed." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Walsh can help. Walsh and me. And Jesse, for the smaller things." "Why Jesse?" She thought about a boy who passed bread at dinner like it was a political act. "Because he's been there from the beginning and nobody pays attention to what he notices." Cole considered this. Around them, the room hummed and shifted. Someone was playing a fiddle near the back wall. People danced in the unself-conscious way of people who don't dance very often. "Abigail." Cole said it in the same deliberate way he'd said it the night he thanked her. Like using her first name was still something he chose rather than something automatic. She looked at him. "Are you afraid of him?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not a test. She thought about it honestly. "I think he's capable of more than cut fences," she said. "I think he's been building this for years, and he's patient, and he has money and relationships, and he's used to winning." She paused. "Yes, in a reasonable way." Cole nodded slowly. "Good." "Good?" People who aren't afraid of him tend to underestimate him. He looked across the room to where Hawthorne stood, laughing at something Aldrich had said. "We can't afford that." She looked too. Hawthorne's laugh was genuine seeming, easy, the laugh of a man enjoying his evening. Only if you knew what to look for did you notice the way his eyes tracked the room, even while the rest of his face was occupied with being charming. "No," she said. "We can't." The new year came in quietly at the Mercer Ranch. Cole was not a man who marked occasions with much ceremony, and so January 1st passed much like December 31st, with the same cold and the same work and the same particular silence of a house where two people were still, carefully, learning each other. Abigail had begun to understand the rhythms of him. He was up before anyone else in the house and was usually in his office or out in the yard by the time she came down. He ate breakfast alone more often than not because he was antisocial, but because that was when he thought, and thinking for Cole was a solitary activity. He asked direct questions and expected direct answers, and was uncomfortable with the decorative form of conversation where people said things without meaning them. He wasn't unkind. He was simply a man who had built his emotional life around a limited number of things and had learned to protect those things very carefully. She knew there had been someone before her, not from anything Cole said, but from the careful way he avoided certain topics, the absence of any personal objects in the main room, the spare quality of a house that had been lived in by a man alone for long enough that the aloneness had become architectural. She didn't ask about it. It wasn't her place yet, and might not be for a long time, and she was patient about the things that required patience. What she was not patient about were the fences. By mid-January, 3 more sections of western boundary fence had been damaged. The pattern was exactly what she'd mapped, always near the creek corridor, always in the sections that, if they remained unrepaired, would begin to make the western boundary legally ambiguous under territorial land code. She knew enough about land law, having sat with Cole's records for the past months, to understand that a disputed boundary required survey resolution, and survey resolution required a county surveyor, and the county surveyor was the same man she'd seen standing with Hawthorne and Aldrich, and the unidentified lawyer at the winter social. Walsh had taken to writing the western boundary daily, which meant he was losing 3 hours of productive time to a problem that should not exist. And Walsh, quiet, economical Walsh, had begun to develop a specific expression when the subject came up that communicated more than any number of words about how much he disliked being in that position. "File a complaint with the county sheriff," Abigail told Cole. He looked at her. "I've filed 2 already." "File a 3rd. In writing, with a detailed incident log attached." She set the log on his desk. She'd been keeping it since December, every incident dated and described and cross-referenced with the boundary maps. "The point isn't to get the sheriff to do something. The point is to create a paper record that establishes a pattern before anyone can claim the boundary is genuinely disputed." Cole looked at the log. He flipped through several pages. His jaw tightened at something in the middle. "When did this one happen?" He pointed at an entry from the previous week. Tuesday night. Walsh found it Wednesday morning. He didn't tell me. He told me. I told him I was adding it to the log and would bring everything to you together. A pause. I should know when these things happen immediately. You're right. I'll change how we're doing it. He looked at her. You're not going to argue that the log was a better approach? The log was a better approach for documentation purposes. You should still be told immediately. Both things are true. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. She slid the sheriff's complaint form across the desk. She'd already drafted it. He read it. He made 2 small changes in the margins. He signed it. I'll write it into town tomorrow, she said. I'll send Jesse. I'd like to go myself. She met his eyes. I want people to see that I'm the one handling it, that this comes from both of us. He held her gaze for a moment, then, take Jesse with you. Of course. She took Jesse and she rode into Harrow Creek, and she filed the complaint with the sheriff personally, and she made sure that at least 4 people she recognized from the winter social saw her do it. She was polite and direct, and thanked the sheriff's deputy for his time and rode home without hurrying. It was a small move, but the thing about small moves, she had come to understand, was that they accumulated. Victor Hawthorne had been making small moves for years. That was how you built something. One piece at a time, patiently, with the understanding that the structure you were creating would only be visible once enough pieces were in place. She was learning to build her own structure. The same afternoon she returned from town, she found a letter waiting at the ranch, addressed to Cole but delivered in her absence. She didn't open it. She set it on his desk and left it there. When Cole came in, he opened it and read it and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he came and found her in the kitchen. Hawthorne has filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office, he said, on the Western Boundary Creek access. He's claiming a prior grazing right that predates the Mercer deed. She had been expecting something. She had not been expecting it this fast. What's the claim based on? Cole held up the letter. A document that apparently proves his family used the creek corridor before my father bought the land. She kept her voice even. Is the document legitimate? I don't know. He put the letter on the table. But it's dated 1847, and my father bought the land in 1851. And if the Territorial Land Office accepts it as valid, the western boundary becomes subject to a rights of prior use claim that could take the creek access out of Mercer hands permanently. The kitchen was very quiet. He's been planning this for a long time, she said. Yes. Then he's made it this complicated on purpose, because complicated favors the person with more lawyers. She looked at the letter. Who has the Mercer Ranch land deeds? The original surveys? In my office safe. We need to find out if the 1847 date is possible. What was happening on that land before your father bought it? Whether a prior grazing right, even if it existed, was legally extinguished by the 1851 sale. I'd need a lawyer for that. Then we need a lawyer, not Slade, someone not connected to this county. She looked at him steadily. How fast can you get one here? Cole was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man who had always handled his own affairs, and was being asked to admit that this one was too large for that approach. I know someone in Wichita, he said. He's good. He's expensive. How expensive? Cole looked at her with something that, on a different face, might have been a small, grim kind of humor. More than the Eastfield wheat will cover. What about 2 years of Eastfield wheat? He thought about it. Maybe. She nodded once. Write to him tonight. He did. Outside, the wind had come up off the plains in the particular way it did in January. Not dramatic, just relentless, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself but simply settled in and stayed. The ranch went about its evening business, horses in the stable, hands in the bunkhouse, Dora banking the kitchen fire for the night. Abigail sat at the kitchen table after Cole had gone to write his letter, and she thought about a document dated 1847 that had appeared at exactly the moment that the fence-cutting pattern had been established, and the sheriff's complaint had been filed. She thought about the timing of things, about how long it takes to build a scheme that covers years and spans county offices and requires multiple moving parts to align. She thought about how Hawthorne had smiled at her across the room at the winter social, the smile of a man who was certain he was going to win. She was tired. The kind of tired that isn't fixed by sleep because it comes from the accumulated weight of months of constant alertness, of never being fully at ease, of building something while someone else works to take it apart. But underneath the tired was something else, something that had been growing since the day she'd picked a paper off the ground in front of ranch hands who wouldn't look at her, since the day she'd found the skimming in the second ledger, since the morning she'd walked the west boundary and understood what the fence cuts were really for. She was angry. Not the hot, reactive kind of anger that makes people careless. The cold, clarifying kind that makes them careful. The kind that lasts. She got up, banked the fire herself, and went to bed. The lawyer's name was Edmund Carr, and he arrived from Wichita on a Thursday in late February, which was the worst week of the winter for travel, and which Abigail suspected said something deliberate about his character. He was 53, compact, with the unhurried manner of a man who had learned that urgency was often a form of theater, and that the people who moved the slowest in courtrooms tended to win the most. He read every document Cole gave him without comment, asked for 3 cups of coffee over the course of 4 hours, and then sat back and said, "The 1847 document is the problem." "Is it legitimate?" Cole asked. "That's the wrong question." Carr set down his cup. "The right question is whether it can be made to appear legitimate long enough to get a territorial land commissioner to issue a temporary injunction on your creek access, because that's what Hawthorne is after. Not a final judgment. He knows the timeline on that is long. He wants the injunction." Abigail, sitting across the table with her incident log open in front of her, looked up. "Why the injunction specifically?" Carr glanced at her with the brief, recalibrating look of a man who had expected to be speaking primarily to the rancher and was adjusting. "Because a temporary injunction on your western water access, even one that gets overturned in 6 months, does 3 things in the meantime. It limits how much of your land you can productively graze this spring. It introduces legal uncertainty about your western boundary that makes your property difficult to use as loan collateral. And it signals to those 3 smaller ranchers between your land and the Dunmore lease that the water situation is unstable, which makes them more likely to accept whatever offer Hawthorne puts in front of them." The room was quiet. "He doesn't need to win," Abigail said. "He needs to create enough uncertainty to make other things happen." "Correct," Carr said. He looked at her more directly now. "You've thought about this." "Some?" "What have you thought?" She glanced at Cole, who gave her nothing in either direction. No encouragement, no restraint. Just his usual stillness, waiting. "The 1847 document needs to be challenged at the source," she said. "Not just disputed, shown to be impossible or forged. Because if we simply argue against its validity in a hearing, we're in a he-said-she-said position, and Hawthorne has relationships with the county officials who'd be deciding it." She paused. "But if the document itself has a flaw, a date that doesn't align with territorial records, a signature from someone who wasn't in the county in 1847, a seal that didn't exist until later, that's different. That's not a dispute, that's a fact." Carr studied her. "Do you have access to the territorial records?" "Not yet. They're public record. The land office in the county seat holds everything from the territorial period." He picked up his coffee. "Someone would need to go through them." "I'll go," she said. Cole looked at her. "The county seat is 2 days' ride." "I know where it is. Hawthorne has people there." "I imagine he does." She met Cole's eyes. "Which is why I should go before anyone knows I'm going." The silence that followed had several things inside it. Cole's instinct, she had come to understand, was to protect, not from condescension exactly, but from the specific anxiety of a man who had lost things before and was aware of how quickly things could be lost. The tension between that instinct and the part of him that had learned, over the past months, to trust her judgment was visible in the set of his jaw. Carr watched both of them with the patient neutrality of a man who understood he was witnessing a domestic negotiation that had legal implications. "I'll have someone ride with her," Cole said finally. "Walsh?" she said. "Walsh." Carr set down his cup. "Go as soon as the weather allows. And take paper. You'll want to copy anything relevant by hand. The land office may not permit removal of documents." "I know how to copy records," she said. He looked at her again with that recalibrating expression. "Yes," he said. "I believe you do, Chats." They left before dawn on a Monday, Walsh riding beside her in the specific silence of someone who understood that unnecessary conversation on a cold morning was its own kind of crime. The road to the county seat ran northwest through a landscape that was stripped down to its essentials by February. Brown grass, pale sky, the occasional dark line of a tree break along a creek. It was not beautiful in any decorative sense, but there was something honest about it that Abigail had come to appreciate, the same way she'd come to appreciate Walsh's economy of expression. They stopped once at midday, ate without much ceremony, and rode on. She used the riding time to think through what she was looking for. Carr had given her a list: specific land transfers, survey dates, witness signatures on territorial documents from the period around 1847 to 1852. The key was finding any record that touched the Mercer land corridor, or the Hawthorne family name, or the creek access specifically. A prior grazing right that genuinely predated the Mercer deed would have required some form of registration in the territorial land records. If the 1847 document Hawthorne had produced was real, there should be corroborating evidence in those records. If there was no corroborating evidence, that absence was itself meaningful. And if the document was forged, if someone had created it after the fact, then it was forged by someone who knew enough about the period to make it plausible, but might not have known enough to make it accurate. Forgeries were built from what people thought the past looked like, not from what it actually was. The devil was always in the specific details that forgers tended to get wrong. She had spent 2 evenings before they left reading everything Cole had in his safe about the original land purchase, every document his father had signed, every survey notation, every transfer record. She'd memorized the names of the witnesses. She'd noted the specific language used in the territorial land grants of that period. She was not a lawyer, but she was systematic, and she had a very good memory. And sometimes systematic memory was enough. The county seat was a larger town than Harrow Creek, with the particular energy of a place where official things happened. A courthouse, a land office, a bank that looked more permanent than the buildings around it. Walsh rode with her to the land office and stationed himself in the chair nearest the door with the calm, immovable quality of a man who was prepared to sit there for as long as required. The clerk at the land office was a young man named Devlin, who was clearly unaccustomed to women arriving alone to review territorial records, and showed this uncertainty in the overly formal way he addressed her, and the 2 separate occasions he asked if she was expecting someone to join her. "Just me," she said both times pleasantly. He gave her a reading room and a box of records and a disapproving look that she ignored, and she sat down and opened the first file and started working. It took 4 hours to find what she needed, which meant it took 4 hours of reading land transfers, survey notations, correspondence between territorial officials, and the cramped handwriting of clerks who had lived and died before she was born. Her hand cramped from copying. The light in the reading room was poor and got worse as the afternoon went on. But she found it. The 1847 document that Hawthorne had filed referred to a territorial land commissioner named Harlan Burt as one of its witnesses, a man who, according to a letter in the county seat's own records, had not arrived in the territory until 1849. 2 years after the date on the document he was supposed to have witnessed. She sat very still for a moment. Then she copied the letter twice, slowly and carefully, including the date and the official seal at the top, which was a different seal from the one used after the territorial reorganization of 1848. A detail she recognized because Cole's father's original deed used the post-reorganization seal, and she had spent 2 evenings memorizing what it looked like. She also copied 3 other documents that showed the Hawthorne family name appearing in county records, all of them dated 1853 or later. Nothing before. Nothing near 1847. When she came out of the reading room, Walsh looked at her face and stood up immediately. "Good?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Let's go." They were back at the ranch by Wednesday evening. Cole met them in the yard before they'd finished unsaddling, which was how she knew he'd been watching for them. She told him what she'd found while they were still standing in the yard, because she couldn't wait until they were inside. Walsh stood nearby, his horse's reins in his hand, listening with the same quiet attention he gave everything. Cole's face, as she talked, went through several changes that were small and controlled, and that she was getting better at reading. When she mentioned Harlan Burt and the 2-year gap, something in his jaw changed. "That's enough?" he asked. "For Carr? It should be enough to challenge the document in a formal hearing. A witness who wasn't in the territory when he allegedly witnessed a transaction is... That's not a technicality. That's the document being impossible." She paused. Combined with the complete absence of any Hawthorne family record in the county before 1853, it builds a picture. He'll have a response prepared. Of course he will. But his response will be a story. This is documentation. She held up the copied papers. 2 different things. Cole looked at the papers for a moment. Then he looked at her. Not the careful, measuring look, not the considering look. A different look. Something she didn't have a clean name for, but that settled somewhere in her chest in a way that was different from anything she'd felt since arriving in Harrow Creek. "Come inside," he said. "I'll send for Carr." Scared. What happened in the 6 weeks between her return from the county seat and the land office hearing was the hardest stretch of the entire conflict, because it was the period when Hawthorne understood that something had shifted and responded accordingly. The first thing that happened was the cattle. 14 head from the south pasture went missing over 2 nights in mid-March. Walsh found the cut fence, western boundary again, but south of the creek corridor this time, which was a different location from the established pattern. Deliberate misdirection, Abigail thought, either to confuse the incident log pattern or to pull Walsh's attention to the south while something else was happening elsewhere. She noted it in the log and didn't change Walsh's boundary writing schedule. The second thing was the crops. Someone got into the east field the night of March 18th and pulled up approximately a quarter of the winter wheat. Not trampled, pulled, by hand, methodically, in a pattern that suggested several people working quickly in the dark. Jesse found it in the morning and stood at the edge of the ruined section with his hat in his hands and didn't say anything for a long time. Abigail stood beside him and looked at it. "We can replant the outer sections," she said finally. "The loss will cut the yield, but it won't eliminate it." Jesse's jaw was tight. He was 17 and he had worked that field in cold mornings, and he was angrier than she'd seen him. "Who does this?" "Someone being paid to," she said. "Come on. I need you to help me document it before anyone touches anything." They measured and recorded, and she photographed it as best she could in writing. The size of the damaged area, the method, the direction of the pulled rows. She didn't know yet whether it would matter. She documented it because documentation had become the closest thing she had to a weapon, and you didn't put down a weapon because you weren't sure when you'd need it. The third thing was the rumor. It started, as most damaging rumors did, not as a direct accusation, but as a question posed to enough people that the question itself became the accusation. The question, as it circulated through Harrow Creek and the surrounding ranches, was this: had anyone else noticed that the Mercer Ranch's financial troubles had started around the time the new wife arrived? Abigail heard it from the wife of the county registrar, who wrote out specifically to tell her, because they had developed, since the winter social, a straightforward and mutual respect that functioned as something approaching friendship. "I thought you should know," the woman said. Her name was Clara, and she was direct in the way of people who have decided that being indirect wastes time they don't have. "I don't know who started it, but it's moving fast. People are saying the ranch is struggling, that the cattle loss and the field damage are evidence of mismanagement." "Whose mismanagement?" Clara looked at her steadily. "Yours?" Abigail sat with that for a moment. "And what are people saying about Hector Dills?" "Most people don't remember why Dills left. The story that seems to be going around is that he was let go because the new wife wanted control of the operation. She had expected something like this. She had not expected how much it would cost to hear it said plainly. "Thank you for coming out," she said. "What are you going to do?" "What I've been doing." She looked at Clara. "Is there anything in what's being said that an honest accounting of the ranch's current status would contradict?" Clara thought about it. "Not if the accounting was public. Then that's where we start." She went to Cole that evening and told him about the rumor and told him what she thought they needed to do. He listened with his jaw set and his hands flat on the desk, and when she finished, he said, "I'm not going to let you defend yourself against a lie. It's not about defending myself, it's about making the truth available before the lie becomes the version people have memorized." She leaned forward slightly. Cole, I need you to trust me on this. He looked at her. The word trust sat between them with all of its history, all the particular weight it carried for a man who had learned its cost in ways she still didn't fully know. What do you need? He said. Invite the 3 small ranchers between our land and the Dunmore lease for supper, the ones Hawthorne wants. I want them to see the ranch, the real numbers, what the East Field produced before the sabotage and what it'll still produce, what the herd looks like, what the ledgers look like. You want to show them the books? I want them to see what a functioning operation looks like, so that when Hawthorne offers them a lifeline because the water uncertainty is making them nervous, they have a comparison point. Cole was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he was going to say no. Thursday, he said. I'll send word. The 3 ranchers came on Thursday. They were cautious men in the way of people who have survived on margins thin enough that every social invitation carries a potential obligation, and they sat at the long table where Hector Dills had once held court and ate Dora's cooking with the careful appreciation of people who didn't eat this well very often. Abigail had spent 2 days preparing, not the meal. That was Dora's domain, and she had learned by now exactly where that domain's borders were. What she had prepared were the accounts, organized clearly and simply, the kind of presentation her father would have recognized. Nothing hidden, nothing inflated, the numbers doing the work. She didn't present them formally. She set them on the table after supper, along with the incident log, and talked the ranchers through them the way she talked through anything, directly, without performing confidence she didn't have, acknowledging where the numbers were weaker than she'd like. The 3 men listened. They asked questions that were specific and practical, the questions of men who understood land operations and weren't going to be talked past. One of them, a man named Haskell, who ran a mid-sized cattle operation and had the weathered economy of someone who had been ranching since before the territorial period, looked at the incident log and said, "All of this is the western boundary?" "The majority." "Someone wants your creek access." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Hawthorne offered me a water-sharing agreement last month, said there might be uncertainty about Mercer water rights in the near future, and he wanted to make sure my cattle were protected." The room was very quiet. "What did you tell him?" Cole asked. "Told him I'd think about it." Haskell looked between them. "I'm still thinking about it." "Think about what the agreement would actually require," Abigail said. "Not what he's telling you it would require. Get someone to read the language." Haskell looked at her. Something in his face was considering rather than closed. "You think it's written to obligate more than it promises." "I think Victor Hawthorne doesn't offer things without getting something larger in return." Haskell nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't leave early either, and when the 3 ranchers rode out that night, she saw him talking to Walsh by the gate for several minutes before mounting. The next morning, Walsh told her that Haskell's youngest son had been one of the hands who'd repaired Mercer fence line 3 times in the past month, working on his own time for a reason he'd told Walsh was simple. "He says the Mercers pay fair and Hawthorne doesn't." She filed that away. The land office hearing was set for the 2nd week of April in the county seat, before a territorial land commissioner named Fitch, who had been in his position for 6 years and had a reputation for procedural precision that cut in both directions. He was hard to manipulate, but he was also inflexible about process, which meant every piece of evidence had to be submitted in exactly the right form. Carr spent the week before the hearing in Harrow Creek, working from Cole's office, and the house took on the particular quality of a place where serious things were being organized. Papers covered the desk. Carr muttered to himself sometimes when he was reading. Jesse was sent to town twice on errands related to document preparation and returned each time looking importantly purposeful. 3 days before the hearing, something happened that Abigail had not prepared for. A woman came to the ranch. She arrived alone, on a horse that was good but not showy, and she asked for Abigail specifically. Not for Cole, not for Walsh. For Abigail. Jesse brought her to the kitchen, and Abigail looked at her and found a woman of about 40, sharp-featured, with the kind of self-containment that comes from a long habit of not relying on anyone. "My name is Ruth Garner," the woman said. "I work accounts for the county surveyor's office." Abigail set down what she was holding. "Sit down." Ruth Garner sat. She folded her hands on the table and looked at Abigail with the level directness of someone who had made a decision and was past the point of reconsidering it. "I've been following what's happening with the Mercer land claim," she said. "I have access to the surveyor's files. 3 weeks ago, I was asked to prepare a comparison survey, one that would be presented at the hearing as evidence that the Mercer western boundary was historically contested." "By whom?" "The request came through the county surveyor, who has a relationship with Victor Hawthorne that is not appropriate for a county official." The kitchen was very still. "The comparison survey," Abigail said carefully. "Is it accurate?" Ruth's jaw tightened. "It uses a 1849 survey base that has a known measurement error in the western corridor, an error that was identified and corrected in the 1853 resurvey. The comparison survey uses the erroneous measurements to suggest the boundary was different than it actually was." "And you were asked to prepare this?" "I was asked to compile it. I noticed the error immediately. When I brought it to the surveyor, I was told the 1853 corrections were not relevant to the current question." She paused. "I've been doing this work for 14 years. The 1853 corrections are always relevant." Abigail looked at her. "Why are you here?" "Because I've been watching what's happening in this county for 3 years, and I'm tired of it." Ruth's voice was flat and certain. "And because I have children, and I'd like them to grow up somewhere where the land records mean what they say they mean." It was not a dramatic speech. That was what made it land the way it did. "Will you testify at the hearing?" Abigail asked. "Yes." "You understand what that means, for your position." Ruth Garner looked at her with the specific expression of a woman who has already counted the cost and paid it in advance. "I understand." Abigail called for Cole. Carr listened to Ruth Garner for 45 minutes and asked questions that were precise and occasionally relentless, the questions of a man testing for weak points before an opponent could find them. Ruth answered every one without flinching. When Carr was done, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly. "The erroneous survey presented at the hearing combined with a witness who can explain exactly why it's erroneous," he said. "That's not a technical argument. That's the hearing ending early." "Hawthorne will try to discredit her," Cole said. "He'll try. She's a 14-year county employee with no prior complaints and no discernible motivation except professional integrity." Carr looked at Ruth. "That's harder to discredit than it sounds." Ruth said nothing. She seemed uninterested in being praised. "She'll need somewhere safe to stay between now and the hearing," Abigail said. "If Hawthorne finds out she came here, she stays here," Cole said. He said it without hesitation, without looking at Abigail for confirmation. Then he did look at her briefly, and she gave him a small nod that was both agreement and something else, something she couldn't quite name. "The hearing is in 3 days," Carr said. "We write at first light Wednesday." That night, after Ruth had been settled in the spare room and Carr had gone back to his papers, and Cole had done his last walkthrough of the property as he always did before bed, Abigail sat at the kitchen table alone. She was thinking about the shape of what they'd built, the incident log, the county seat records, the copies she'd made by lamplight in a reading room with poor light and a cramping hand, Ruth Garner's testimony, Haskell's son repairing fence line on his own time, Clara writing out to Warner, Jesse standing at the edge of the ruined wheat with his hat in his hands and his jaw tight. None of it had been easy. None of it had gone the way she'd planned at the start. She'd made mistakes. The root cellar, the conversation with Dills about the East Field, a dozen smaller things she'd done too fast or too slow or in the wrong order. She was still making mistakes. She would probably make one in the next 3 days that she couldn't see coming. But the structure was there. Built piece by piece, the way you build anything that has to hold weight. She heard footsteps and Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her sitting there with no particular task in front of her, which was unusual enough that he paused. "You should sleep," he said. "I know." He came in and poured a glass of water and stood at the counter and drank it. Outside, the April wind had picked up, the kind of wind that meant the season was genuinely shifting, winter finally losing its grip. "Cole," she looked at him. "Whatever happens at the hearing, I want you to know that I came here to build something, not to take anything. I know that's what people thought. Some of them still think it." He was quiet for a moment. I know that. Do you? He set down the glass. He looked at her with the directness that was the thing she'd come to trust most in him. His inability to perform feelings he didn't have, which meant that when something showed in his face, it was real. I knew it before I wanted to, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, slowly. Get some sleep, he said again. Quieter this time. Yeah, she said. Okay. She went upstairs, and the ranch settled around her in the dark. The horses, the fields, the fence lines. Walsh would ride at dawn, the wheat coming back in the sections they'd replanted, the creek moving along the western boundary regardless of who claimed it, the way water always moves, indifferent to disputes and documents and the ambitions of men who believe that enough patience can turn the world into what they want it to be. She slept, and in 3 days they would ride to the county seat, and what happened there would determine what the next decade of this land looked like. She was afraid, and she was ready, and those two things had learned, over the past several months, to live in her at the same time. They rode to the county seat on Wednesday morning, 5 of them. Cole and Abigail, Carr with his document case strapped across his saddle, Ruth Garner on her good plain horse, and Walsh, who had said nothing about coming and had simply appeared at the gate before dawn with his horse saddled and his rifle in the scabbard, which settled the question of whether he was coming. Jesse had wanted to come. Abigail had told him no, and his face had done the particular thing it did when he disagreed but trusted her enough not to argue. She needed someone at the ranch she trusted. She told him that plainly, and he'd straightened slightly and nodded, and she knew he'd ride the western boundary twice a day until they returned. The road was better in April than it had been in February. The ground firmer, the sky a pale clear blue that carried none of winter's weight. Nobody talked much during the ride. Carr reviewed documents from his saddlebag at irregular intervals in a way that looked uncomfortable and probably was. Ruth Garner rode with the self-contained stillness of someone who had made her decision and closed the door on second-guessing it. Walsh watched the road and the land around it with the habitual attention of a man for whom watchfulness had become indistinguishable from breathing. Cole rode beside Abigail for most of the morning. They didn't talk. They hadn't talked much in the 2 days since the kitchen conversation, but the quality of the silence between them had changed. It was less careful than it used to be. Less like two people managing a distance and more like two people who had simply run out of things they needed to say before they said them. At one point, when the road narrowed along a creek bank and they had to ride single file, his horse brushed close to hers and he reached out briefly. Not a gesture that announced itself, just a hand on her arm for a moment, barely a second. And then the road widened and he moved ahead. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. But she rode the rest of the morning with something settled in her chest that hadn't been there before. They arrived in the county seat by late afternoon and took rooms at the hotel on the main street, which was the only hotel, which meant that by the time they'd stabled their horses, word had already moved through whatever channel words move through in small county towns. And when Abigail came down to supper, she was aware of being looked at by 3 men at a table near the window who had the particular quality of men being paid to be present and observant. She looked back at them steadily until one of them looked away first. Carr spent the evening in Cole's room going through the documents one final time, and Abigail sat with them for 2 hours, reviewing the sequence they'd established, the Harlan Burt letter, the absence of Hawthorne family records before 1853, Ruth's testimony about the erroneous survey, and the incident log, which Carr intended to enter as evidence of a sustained pattern of interference with Mercer land access. Hawthorne will have Slade presenting his case, Carr said. Slade is competent. He'll try to move the focus away from the document's validity and toward the broader question of historical use, which is harder to disprove with records because it relies on testimony and living memory. Whose testimony? Cole asked. He'll have people. Men who'll say their fathers grazed that corridor in the 1840s. Men who remember water agreements that weren't written down. Carr looked at them over his papers. Living memory is a flexible thing. What do we do about it? We don't fight testimony with testimony. We'll lose that. We anchor every argument back to the documents. Every time Slade tries to move into living memory, I bring the commissioner back to paper. Carr tapped the Harlan Burt letter. This is our center. A witness who was provably not in the territory cannot have witnessed a document. That's not interpretation. That's impossibility. Abigail had read the letter so many times she could recite it from memory. What if Slade argues the letter is misidentifying a different Harlan Burt, that there were two men with that name? Carr looked at her. Have you read law? No. Because that's the argument I'd make if I were Slade and I was desperate. He picked up a different document, which is why I have 3 separate territorial census records showing only one Harlan Burt in this territory between 1845 and 1860, and his arrival date consistent across all 3. He set the papers down. They can try it. I'm ready for it. She nodded. She looked at Cole, who was watching Carr with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. Get some sleep, Carr said, which was the second time in 3 days someone had said that to her. Tomorrow is going to be long. The land office hearing room was smaller than she'd expected. It seated perhaps 30 people, with a raised platform at the front, where Commissioner Fitch sat behind a table that was too large for the room and gave the impression of having been moved there from somewhere more official. Fitch himself was a dry, spare man in his mid-60s, with the demeanor of someone who had spent his career managing disputes between people who were certain they were right and had learned to find both of them tedious. Hawthorne arrived with Slade and 2 other men who carried documents. He was dressed well, not extravagantly, with the careful appearance of a man who understood the value of looking trustworthy rather than wealthy. He saw Cole and nodded with the courtesy of a man who was not yet finished being civil. He saw Abigail and held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Not a challenge exactly, but an acknowledgement. He knew she was the reason they were here. She held his gaze and didn't move anything in her face. The room filled. Commissioner Aldrich was there, in the back row, which told her that the county commission was watching this closely. The county surveyor sat near the front, and she watched him scan the room, and pause when he found Ruth Garner, and something in his face shifted in a way that was not comfortable to look at. Ruth sat beside Abigail and kept her eyes forward. Commissioner Fitch opened the hearing with the procedural terseness of a man who had done this many times, and saw no reason to make it longer than necessary. He outlined the claim, Hawthorne's assertion of prior grazing rights on the western corridor of the Mercer property based on a document dated 1847, and the Mercer response, which challenged the document's validity and the boundary survey being used to support the claim. Slade presented first. He was what Carr had described, competent, organized, with a manner that was measured and reasonable and projected the confidence of a man who expected to win. He presented the 1847 document with the care of handling something fragile and valuable, and he talked about historical use in the patient, detailed language of a man constructing a picture out of many small pieces. He called his first witness, an elderly man named Thurston, who said his father had run cattle along that creek corridor before the Mercer family ever set foot in the territory, and the way he said it, quietly, without drama, gave it a weight that raw assertion wouldn't have had. Carr cross-examined Thurston with a careful gentleness that looked like respect and was actually dismantling. He asked Thurston how old he'd been in 1847. 11, Thurston said. Carr asked what a boy of 11 typically remembered about where exactly cattle grazed on which specific creek corridor. Thurston was less certain by the end than he'd been at the beginning, without Carr having said anything that could be called aggressive. Slade called 2 more witnesses. Both said reasonable-sounding things about historical patterns of land use. Carr cross-examined both with the same patient, dismantling courtesy. Then Fitch asked for the Mercer response. Carr stood and presented the Harlan Burt letter first. He read the relevant section into the record, the date of Burt's arrival in the territory, 1849. And then he presented the 1847 document with Burt's witness signature, and he let the room sit with the arithmetic for a moment before he said anything. Commissioner Fitch, a man cannot witness a document in 1847 if he did not arrive in this territory until 1849. This is not a question of interpretation. It is a question of sequence. Slade was on his feet. The letter in question refers to a Harlan Burt who may not be the same individual. Fitch held up a hand. Mr. Slade, you'll have the opportunity to respond. Continue, Mr. Carr. Carr placed the 3 census records on the table. He walked through them, methodically, without drama, the way a man presents a thing he knows is solid and doesn't need to be dressed up. One Harlan Burt in the territory record, one arrival date, one departure date, 1857. No ambiguity about the individual. Then he called Ruth Garner. She took her position at the front of the room with the same self-contained stillness she'd had since the moment she arrived at the Mercer Ranch. Fitch asked her to identify herself and her position, which she did clearly. Carr asked her to describe the survey comparison she had been asked to prepare and the error she had identified. She described it. She was precise and specific and entirely without performance. She used the language of her profession, not simplified for an audience, not inflated for effect. She said what she knew in the plainest possible way, and the plainness of it was its own form of authority. When she described being told by the county surveyor that the 1853 corrections were not relevant to the current question, Fitch's expression changed for the first time. Something in it became more focused. The county surveyor 3 rows back was very still. Slade's cross-examination of Ruth was aggressive in a way that his earlier manner had not prepared the room for, and Abigail thought that was a mistake, because it made the aggression itself seem like information. He questioned her competence, her understanding of historical survey methodology, her motivations for coming forward. Ruth answered each question with the specific, unbothered directness of someone who had 14 years of professional record to stand on and nothing personal to defend. At one point, Slade said, "Isn't it possible that your interpretation of the 1853 corrections reflects a bias toward the Mercer position?" Ruth looked at him. "No," she said. "The 1853 corrections are what they are regardless of who benefits from them. The math doesn't change based on who's in the room." Someone in the back of the room made a sound, not laughter exactly. Something quieter than that. Fitch called a recess. During the recess, Carr found them in the corridor and spoke low and quick. "He's going to try to introduce a second witness on Burt, someone who'll say they knew 2 men by that name." He asked Fitch to allow additional testimony. "Will Fitch allow it?" Cole asked. "I don't know yet. If he does, it delays the decision." Carr was thinking quickly, visibly. "We need to be ready for a longer hearing." Abigail was looking at the far end of the corridor where Hawthorne stood with Slade. They were talking in the low, tight way of men revising a plan. Hawthorne's face was still composed, still pleasant, but there was something different about the set of his shoulders than there had been 2 hours ago. She turned to Carr. "Is there anything in the record about the Dunmore lease, the one Hawthorne holds to the north?" Carr frowned. "What about it?" "He said it was a prior claim lease from the territorial period. If the same Harlan Burt appears as a witness on that document," Carr went very still. "I didn't check the Dunmore lease records," he said. "They weren't part of the claim filing." "No, but they're public record. And if Burt witnessed that document too, and the date on the Dunmore lease has the same problem—" She stopped. Carr looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Cole. "I need 30 minutes and someone who can run." "Walsh," Cole said. Walsh was at the land office records room in 4 minutes. He was back in 22, which, given the size of the records room and the specificity of what he was looking for, was genuinely remarkable. And the expression on his face when he returned told Abigail what he'd found before he said a word. He handed Carr a copied page. Carr looked at it. He made a sound that was not quite a word. The Dunmore lease document, registered in the Territorial Land Office, bore the witness signature of Harlan Burt. Dated 1846, 1 year before the already impossible 1847 document. Harlan Burt, who had arrived in the territory in 1849, had apparently been witnessing land documents in 1846, 1847, and presumably whatever else they hadn't found yet. He used the same forger, Carr said, or he used the same false name across multiple documents and didn't think anyone would ever look at them together. Cole's face was very still. "The Dunmore lease is the basis for his water corridor claim to the north." "Yes. If the lease document is also invalid, then his claim to the northern corridor may be just as compromised as his claim to your western boundary." Carr was already moving back toward the hearing room. "This changes the hearing considerably. When Commissioner Fitch reconvened, he ruled that Slade's additional witness could provide a brief statement, and the statement, when it came, was exactly as thin as Carr had predicted. A man who said he'd known two Harlan Burts once, vaguely, in a different county, years ago. Fitch listened to it with the patience of a man doing his professional duty, and then asked Carr if he wished to respond. Carr placed the Dunmore lease copy on the table. He explained in the same methodical and undramatic way he'd explained everything else, what it was and what it showed. He noted that Harlan Burt's witness signature now appeared on 3 separate territorial documents, across 3 separate years, all predating his documented arrival in the territory. He suggested that the pattern raised questions not only about the specific claim before the commissioner, but about the integrity of multiple land documents bearing the same impossible witness. The room had gone very quiet. Fitch looked at the document for a long time. He looked at the county surveyor who was looking at the table in front of him. He looked at Hawthorne. Hawthorne's face was still composed. She had to give him that. Whatever was happening underneath it, the surface held. He was the kind of man who had practiced composure until it was structural, but Slade, beside him, had stopped taking notes. Fitch said he would need time to review the additional evidence and would deliver his ruling within 5 days. He adjourned the hearing. The room began to move, the way rooms move after something has been decided even before the decision is formally announced. People gathered coats and papers and opinions and moved toward the doors. Aldrich, in the back row, left quickly and without meeting anyone's eyes. Carr was at Abigail's elbow. 5 days means he's going to verify the additional material before he rules. He wouldn't take 5 days if he was dismissing it. What does that mean for the ruling? It means I'm cautiously optimistic, which is the most optimistic I get. He picked up his document case. It also means he may refer the Dunmore lease question to the Territorial Attorney General, which opens a much larger investigation than anyone planned for when we walked in this morning. Cole was standing a few feet away, talking to Walsh in low tones. She watched him, the posture that was always slightly braced, the face that gave nothing to people he didn't trust. She watched the tension in his shoulders that had been there since February slowly begin to change. Hawthorne passed them on his way to the door. He stopped. Mrs. Mercer. He said her name the way he'd said it at the winter social, with the pleasant, attentive manner of a man paying a compliment, except that this time it landed differently, and they both knew it. You've been very thorough. The records were thorough, she said. I just read them. He looked at her for a moment. Really looked. Not the assessing glance of someone cataloging a threat, but something more direct than that. Something almost like recognition. Your husband is a fortunate man, he said. He walked out. She stood there for a moment with those words in the air. Not a concession. She didn't think Victor Hawthorne was built for concessions. More like an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who had underestimated something and was updating his understanding, even if he would never say so plainly. Cole appeared beside her. What did he say? Nothing useful. She picked up her bag. Let's go home. Up and patate. The ride home was different from the ride out. The same road, the same pale sky, but the quality of the silence between the 5 of them had shifted into something less pressurized. Walsh had bought a piece of pie from a bakery in the county seat before they left, which was so unexpected that Jesse, when they returned and heard about it, declared it the strangest thing that had happened since he'd started working at the Mercer Ranch. Fitch's ruling came in 4 days, not 5. Cole read the document at his desk with Abigail standing across from him, and when he finished reading it, he put it down and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of someone processing something they'd prepared for but hadn't quite believed would actually happen. The ruling rejected Hawthorne's claim on the western boundary water rights in full, citing the documentary impossibility of the 1847 witness signature. It noted that the integrity of the supporting survey had been challenged by a county records employee with professional standing and ordered a formal survey review. And in the final paragraph by Maus, the paragraph that Carr, when he read it, said was the most significant thing Fitch had written in 6 years on the bench. The commissioner referred the question of the Dunmore lease to the Territorial Attorney General's office for independent review. He opened the whole thing up, Abigail said. Yes. Cole looked at the document. The AG's office doesn't investigate small questions. They investigate patterns. She knew what that meant. Harlan Burt's impossible signature, appearing across multiple documents, was not a single forgery. It was a system. And a system meant other documents, other claims, other properties, where the same method might have been used. Hawthorne's operation in this county had been built, at least partly, on a foundation that was now being examined by people with the authority to pull it apart. The first practical consequence arrived within a week. The county surveyor submitted his resignation, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. The second came 10 days later, when one of the 3 small ranchers between the Mercer land and the Dunmore lease, not Haskell, but the one who had been quietest at supper, sent word that he had declined Hawthorne's water-sharing agreement after having the language reviewed as Abigail had suggested. Haskell came by the ranch himself, one morning in May, and stood in the yard and talked to Cole and Abigail together, which was a thing he hadn't done before. He said he'd heard from his son about the western boundary rides, and he thought maybe there was a conversation worth having about cooperative fence maintenance along the shared corridor, given that the Attorney General's review might take time and the land needed managing in the meantime. Cole said that sounded reasonable. Haskell said he thought so too, and then he stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands and looked at Abigail and said, "You went to the county seat and dug up those records yourself?" "I did." He nodded slowly. "My wife said to say hello." Which was, she understood, its own form of acknowledgement from a man who was not given to elaborate expression. The months that followed were not easy exactly, but they were different in quality from what had come before. The Attorney General's investigation moved slowly, the way official things move, and Hawthorne was still in the county, still operating, still the largest landowner by most measurements. He was not gone, and he was not destroyed, and she had never thought he would be. Powerful men with money and relationships and years of accumulated position do not simply cease because one hearing goes against them. But the shape of things had changed. She noticed it in small ways first. Commissioner Aldrich, who had sat in the back row at the hearing and left without meeting anyone's eyes, stopped by the Mercer booth at the spring market in Harrow Creek and made a point of shaking Cole's hand in public. The wife of the new county surveyor, appointed pending the investigation, introduced herself at the market and was warm and direct in a way that felt like a statement about where she thought things stood. Margaret Holt, who had been notably quiet since the hearing, came by the ranch in early May and sat in the front room and drank tea without conducting reconnaissance, which was its own kind of change. And the land itself responded to what had been done for it. The Eastfield wheat came in that spring at a yield that surprised even Abigail, who had been the one to argue for it. The replanted sections had recovered better than she'd projected. Walsh, who expressed his opinions through the specific gradient of how much or how little he said about a given topic, looked at the field and said, "That'll do." Coming from Walsh, that was approximately equal to a standing ovation. She found Jesse there one morning in June, standing at the edge where the damaged section had been, looking at the full, even growth. "It came back," he said. "Most things do," she said, "if you give them what they need." He looked at her sideways. He was 18 now, had been for a month, and was starting to develop the more considered quality that came with being on the far side of 17. Is that wisdom or just farming? Sometimes they're the same thing. He grinned and went back to work. She watched him go and then stood at the field for a minute longer than she needed to. The wheat moved in the June wind in the particular way of a field that is healthy and properly rooted, the kind of movement that looks effortless from the outside because the work was done earlier, underground, where no one could see it. The ranch continued to expand that summer. Walsh hired 2 additional hands, good ones, men who came with references, and who Walsh had clearly screened with his characteristic thoroughness. Cole purchased the grazing rights to a section of land northeast of the main property that connected them to a water source independent of the disputed western corridor, which was not exactly security, but was something like it. Practical. Forward-looking. He told Abigail about the northeastern purchase the evening he completed it, which was not the way he would have handled information about ranch decisions when she first arrived. He set the papers on the kitchen table and talked her through the terms and asked what she thought about the timing relative to their current cash position. She thought it was probably right by about 6 weeks. She said so. He said he'd thought about that too and had concluded it was worth the timing risk because the northeastern section would not be available after the fall. She said that was fair. He said, "I should have asked you before I signed." She looked at him. "You don't have to ask me before every decision." "I know." He picked up the papers. "I wanted to." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked back at the figures on the table, and she said, "The timing risk is manageable if the Eastfield yield comes in where Walsh thinks it will. And if it doesn't, then we'll figure it out." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the deliberate way of a man who does not say things without knowing what he's saying, "Yes, we will." That was the closest Cole Mercer ever came, in those early years, to saying the thing that was underneath all the other things. She didn't need him to say it more plainly than that. She was a practical woman, and she understood practical men, and she knew that for someone who had learned to guard against loss with the specific vigilance of a person who had been hurt by it before, the simple word "we" was not simple at all. She let it stand. Outside, the June evening settled over the ranch in long amber light, the kind of light that makes even ordinary things look like they mean something. The cattle were in the south pasture. The wheat was in the east field. The western boundary fence, repaired again by Walsh and Haskell's son, working alongside each other on a Tuesday morning, held its line. The ranch was not perfect. It was not saved exactly because saving implied it was finished, and it was not finished. The Attorney General's investigation was ongoing, and Hawthorne had not sold his holdings and left the county, and there would be other problems, other seasons, other decisions made in insufficient light with incomplete information. But it was standing. It was productive. It was more fully itself than it had been a year ago. And Abigail Mercer was standing in it, in the long June light, with the accounts she understood, and the land she had learned, and the people she had not so much won over as simply outlasted with competence and consistency, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided, somewhere between picking a paper off the ground and riding to the county seat in February, that she was not leaving. She was not the woman she had been when she stepped off the stagecoach. That woman had been determined and frightened and holding $31 in the lining of her coat and telling herself that honest was enough. She was still determined. The frightened part had not gone away. It had just gotten more specific, more workable. The way fear does when you spend enough time looking directly at the things that scare you. And she had learned over the course of this difficult and unglamorous year that honest was not just enough. It was the only thing that held up when everything else was tested. Cole came out of the house and stood beside her in the evening light. He looked at the field, the fence line, the long reach of the land. "Walsh thinks we need another water tank on the northeast section," he said. "Walsh is right. It's an expense." So was the lawyer. He made a sound that, on a different man, in different circumstances, would have been a laugh. On Cole, it was approximately that. They stood there in the evening, not touching, not talking. Two people who had come to each other through strange necessity and stayed through something harder and more real than necessity, looking out at the land they had fought for together and had not finished fighting for, and probably never would be. The wheat moved in the wind. The fence line held. The Attorney General's investigation took 14 months. Abigail knew this was fast by the standards of territorial legal proceedings, which moved according to their own internal logic and were largely indifferent to the urgency of the people waiting on them. Carr had told her to expect 2 years. He had also told her not to expect much, because investigations of this kind had a way of narrowing as they progressed, finding the smallest possible set of facts that satisfied the legal requirement without disturbing the larger network of relationships that made county governance function. She had prepared herself for that. She had told Cole to prepare for it too. What she had not prepared for was Edmund Carr riding out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning in August, 14 months after the hearing, with the expression of a man carrying news he had not fully processed himself. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd spread his documents in February of the previous year, and he put a letter in front of them and said, "The AG's office found 7 documents." Cole looked at the letter. 7. 7 separate territorial land documents bearing witness signatures that are impossible by the same method we identified. 3 involve the Hawthorne holdings directly. 4 involve adjacent properties where Hawthorne holds easements or grazing leases. Carr folded his hands on the table. The Dunmore lease is invalid. The Northern Water Corridor access he's held for 9 years has no legal basis. The kitchen was very quiet. What happens to the land? Abigail asked. The Dunmore lease reverts to territorial control for reassignment. The easements on the adjacent properties are voided, and the 3 men who can be shown to have directly participated in the document fraud, the forger, who has already been identified in Wichita, and 2 others, are facing criminal charges under territorial fraud statute. Cole said, Hawthorne himself. Carr was quiet for a moment. Hawthorne engaged the forger through an intermediary. Proving his direct knowledge and intent is... He paused. It's harder. The AG's office believes he knew. Proving it to the standard required for criminal prosecution is a different question. Cole's jaw tightened. However, Carr continued, the civil consequences are substantial regardless of criminal prosecution. The voided documents mean he loses the Northern Corridor access he's used to leverage those 3 small ranches. Without that leverage, and without the Western Boundary claim, his ability to consolidate the creek water rights he's been building toward for a decade is effectively finished. He looked between them. He won't be prosecuted for what he intended to do. But what he intended to do is now impossible. That's not nothing. Abigail looked at the letter. She thought about 14 months of watching the Western Boundary, of Walsh writing it daily, of Jesse logging every incident with the careful handwriting of a young man who had understood what it was for. She thought about Ruth Garner, who had lost her county position, officially through a reorganization that everyone understood was not a reorganization, and had subsequently been hired by a land records firm in Wichita that Carr had recommended, which was not justice exactly, but was better than nothing. She thought about what Carr had said in the hearing room. He doesn't need to win. He needs to create enough uncertainty. Victor Hawthorne had not won. And the thing he had been building, piece by careful piece over the better part of a decade, was not going to be finished. That was real. That was more than she'd allowed herself to expect in the worst months of the previous winter. Thank you, she said to Carr. He nodded once in the way of a man who understood that a job being done well was its own sufficient acknowledgement. Yet, the news moved through the county in the particular way that significant news moves in places where everyone's livelihood is connected. Quickly, incompletely, with a current of feeling underneath the facts that was harder to characterize than simple satisfaction. There were people who had benefited from Hawthorne's operations, directly or indirectly, and for them the news was complicated. There were people who had been on the wrong end of his methods for years and would never say so publicly, and for them it was something more private, more careful. Haskell came by again. He stood in the yard and talked to Cole for a while, and then he came and found Abigail in the east field, where she was walking the irrigation lines with Walsh, because the second water tank on the northeast section had been finished the previous month, and she wanted to understand how the new flow distribution affected the established channels. I heard about the ruling, Haskell said. Word travels fast. Always does out here. He squinted at the field. The summer wheat had been harvested the previous week. The yield had come in slightly above Walsh's estimate, which was the kind of thing that Walsh noted without visible pleasure, but that Abigail had learned to read as satisfaction. I wanted to say something. She waited. My son worked these fence lines, he said, on his own time because he thought it was right. He's 20 years old and he didn't get paid for it and nobody asked him to. He looked at her. I just wanted you to know I know that. She looked back at him. He's a good man. He is. Haskell nodded once, settled. Your operation here has been solid this year, more than solid. He paused. I've got a section to the south I've been thinking about selling. I wanted to tell you first before I put it out to anyone. She understood what that was. It was not a business offer. It was a statement about where he thought things stood, about who he trusted, about the accounting he'd done of the past year and a half, and what conclusion it had led him to. Let me talk to Cole, she said. Of course. He put his hat back on. No rush. He walked back to his horse and rode out, and Walsh, who had been examining the irrigation channel with the focused attention of a man who was not listening to anything else, said without looking up, The south section has good soil. I know, she said. Creek access from the eastern fork, not the contested corridor. I know, Walsh. He made a sound that communicated he was done offering information and went back to the channel. She stood there for a moment in the summer heat, in the field she'd planted on her own mornings before the house was awake, with the irrigation lines she'd walked a dozen times, and the fence lines that had been cut and cut again, and repaired again, and now held. And she thought about the 22-year-old woman who had ridden a stagecoach 3 days with the last of her money in the lining of her coat, and had been told before she dismounted that she was a poor girl chasing a rich man's fortune. That woman had not been wrong about everything. She had known she was capable of more than people expected. She had known that competence, applied consistently and without performance, would eventually be recognized. She had known, in some deep, unglamorous way, that she could outlast the doubt. What she hadn't known was how much it would cost, not in money or in physical effort, though those costs were real. In the specific grinding expenditure of keeping yourself steady when the ground is being cut out from underneath you. In the discipline of not saying things before you had the ground for them. In the loneliness of building something that other people couldn't see yet because it wasn't finished. She was not a romantic about what had been accomplished. The investigation was done, but Hawthorne was still in the county, diminished but not absent, and powerful men who have been diminished tend to look for other directions to apply their energy. The Mercer Ranch was stronger than it had been a year ago, but strength on the frontier was not a permanent condition. It was something you maintained season by season, with attention and labor and the willingness to do the unglamorous work when the glamorous work was finished. She knew all of that. She also knew that the East Field had yielded a third more than Hector Dills had ever gotten from the main planting rotation, and that Ruth Garner was doing work she was good at in Wichita, and that Haskell's son had worked Mercer fence lines because he thought it was right, and that Jesse, who was 19 now and had begun, in his earnest and slightly formal way, to talk about eventually managing his own operation, had learned most of what he knew about land management in the past year and a half by paying attention. Those things were real too. The Harvest Festival that September was the first one Abigail hosted at the Mercer Ranch. And she did it because Cole suggested it, and she said yes before she'd fully thought through what it would require, which was a pattern in their marriage that she had noticed with some frequency and had not managed to break. It required a great deal. Dora made her position on the scope of the undertaking clear through a sustained period of pointed silence that communicated more than complaint would have. Jesse was recruited for tasks he accepted without complaint, but performed with the particular energy of someone who privately had a dozen questions about why this was happening. Walsh organized the yard with the focused efficiency of a man who wanted it done right, so he could stop thinking about it. About 40 people came, ranchers from the surrounding area, some of whom Abigail knew well by now, and some of whom she was still learning. Clara, the county registrar's wife, who had become something that was genuinely a friendship rather than a useful association. Margaret Holt and her agreeable husband Frank, Margaret in a new hat that cost as much as last year's hat, and with an expression that had, over the course of the year, shed at least some of its particular calculating quality and replaced it with something more like honest assessment. Haskell came with his wife and his son. The son, whose name was Thomas, which Abigail had known for months, but which seemed newly significant now that she was meeting him in a social context rather than watching him repair fence line at 6 a.m, shook her hand with the earnest directness of a young man trying to communicate something he didn't have the words for. "Thank you for the field work," she said. He shook his head. It was the right thing to do. It was also hard work on cold mornings. He grinned. He had his father's economy of expression, but his mother's eyes, which were warm and direct. "Worth it," he said, and moved on. She made cornbread. She made it because it was what she knew how to make for a crowd. The recipe her mother had used, cornmeal and a little fat and nothing fancy, the kind of thing that fed people rather than impressing them. Dora had looked at the recipe with the expression of someone determining whether to be offended, and then had said nothing and helped, which was as close to collaboration as they had come in 18 months, and which felt, to Abigail, like its own kind of milestone. The cornbread went fast. That was the thing about simple food made correctly. It didn't last because people kept going back for it, not because they were being polite, but because they wanted more. Cole watched this from across the yard with an expression she'd come to recognize as his version of contentment, not happy in any demonstrative way, but settled. present. A man standing in the middle of his own life without bracing against it. She caught his eye across the yard, and he held her gaze for a moment, and then something that was not quite a smile moved across his face, which from Cole Mercer was approximately the equivalent of a declaration. She looked away before he did. She had learned, over the past year and a half, that the way to exist with Cole's particular form of feeling was to receive it without making too much of it. Not because it didn't matter, but because making too much of it would make him careful again, and she didn't want him careful. She wanted him the way he was right now, standing in September light, in the yard of his own ranch, watching the cornbread disappear, and the people he knew moving around each other, in the easy way of people who are where they're supposed to be. The conversation about Haskell's southern section happened that evening, after the guests had gone and Dora had declared herself finished for the night in a tone that discouraged any alternative interpretation. Jesse was in the bunkhouse. Walsh was doing what Walsh always did at the end of a long day, which was move through the property once in the dark, checking things. Cole and Abigail sat in the front room with the lamp turned low. It was the first time they'd sat in that room together without something specific to discuss. No documents on the table, no plan being worked through, no problem requiring the focused collaboration that had become the primary language of their marriage. It was slightly strange, in the way that the absence of a familiar pressure is strange when you've gotten used to carrying it. Cole said, "What do you think about the Haskell section?" "I think Walsh is right about the soil, and the Eastern Fork access is solid. No dispute history, clean records. I checked." "When did you check?" 2 weeks ago, when Haskell first mentioned it." She looked at him. "You're not surprised." "I stopped being surprised by what you've looked into in advance sometime around October of last year." She thought about October of last year and everything that had been happening then and decided she was glad it was last year. "The price will be fair," she said. "Haskell's not trying to profit. He wants out of the land because he wants to simplify his operation, not because he's in trouble. Can we carry it without straining the Northeast investment? If the spring planning goes the way Walsh projects, yes. If it doesn't," she thought about it honestly, "we'd be tight through the first 2 summers. Manageable tight, not dangerous tight." Cole was quiet for a moment. The lamp made the room smaller and warmer than it was in daylight, and outside the September night had cooled into the first real hint of the autumn that was coming. "I want to hire Thomas Haskell," Cole said. "Full-time, if he's willing." She looked at him. "Walsh's idea or yours?" "Both." "Walsh said something about it last week. I'd already been thinking it. He's good with fence work. I don't know what else he can do. Walsh says he's a natural with the stock. Noticed things during the drives that men twice his age missed." Cole looked at her. "He worked our land because he thought it was right. That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, she heard Walsh's footsteps doing his final round, the familiar, steady sound of someone doing what needed to be done because it needed doing, without drama or expectation of acknowledgement. "Abigail?" Cole said her name in the deliberate way that meant what he was about to say had been considered, not casual. "I want to say something." She waited. He looked at the lamp rather than at her, which was how he handled things that cost him something to say. "When I wrote that letter, the arrangement letter, I was looking for someone practical, someone who could manage a house and not make things harder than they already were." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't looking for what you are." She didn't say anything. "I didn't know what you were," he continued. "I don't know if I would have written the letter if I had." He paused. "I've thought about that." "And?" He looked at her then. "And I'm glad I didn't know. Because I would have talked myself out of it, and that would have been a significant mistake." It was the longest personal speech she had ever heard from Cole Mercer. She understood, knowing him as she did by now, that it had cost him more than the words made it look like. She looked at him for a moment. "You're a hard man to know," she said. "I want you to understand that." "I know. It took me 4 months to figure out that when you go quiet, you're not angry, you're thinking. Most people never figure that out." "I noticed." She looked at the lamp. It took me another 2 months to understand that you trust people by giving them work that matters. That if you hand someone something important and let them carry it, for you, that's the thing." He was quiet. "The East Field," she said. "You didn't tell me to do that. You let me do it, and then you said yes. I understood what that meant, even before I understood you." A long silence. The kind that had things inside it. "I don't say things well," Cole said finally. "The things that matter. You say them, just not with words." He looked at her. Something in his face was open in a way that she'd only seen a few times, the way it got when he was not managing anything, when the habit of protection had momentarily released. "Stay," he said. Just that. She held his gaze. "I wasn't planning to leave." "I know, I wanted to say it anyway." She nodded slowly. Then she looked back at the lamp, and they sat in the quiet room, and outside the September night held the ranch in its cooling dark. And that was the closest thing to a love declaration that Cole Mercer ever made. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the most honest thing she had heard from anyone in 2 years. The years moved in this way that years move when life has found its rhythm. Not slowly and not quickly, but with the specific pace of time that is fully occupied. Seasons accumulated. The ranch expanded into the Haskell southern section, and the spring planting the following year went the way Walsh had projected, and the tight period that Abigail had described as manageable proved itself to be exactly that. Thomas Haskell joined the operation and proved to be, as Walsh had said, naturally gifted with the stock in a way that was not taught but developed. An instinct for animal behavior that made him twice as useful on a cattle drive as a man who'd been doing it longer. He was steady and he was honest, and he treated the work the way his father had raised him to treat it, which was to say with the understanding that it mattered whether you did it right. Jesse, who was 21 by the time the Haskell land was integrated, had begun to grow into his own particular kind of competence. He was not natural with the stock the way Thomas was. He was natural with people, with the specific patient work of maintaining the relationships between the ranch and the surrounding community that determined whether you got help when you needed it or found yourself isolated. He remembered things about people. He showed up when things were hard. Without anyone designating the role, he had become the person at the Mercer Ranch who made sure the county knew it could rely on them. Walsh noticed this and said nothing about it to Jesse directly, which was Walsh's form of approval. He mentioned it once to Abigail, briefly, and she said she'd noticed it too, and that was the extent of the conversation, which was an appropriate length for a conversation between Walsh and Abigail. Dora, who had watched Abigail work in her kitchen for 2 years with the wariness of a woman protecting her territory, arrived one morning in the 3rd year and handed Abigail a written recipe without a word. It was for a biscuit technique that Abigail had been trying to replicate for 6 months, based on having eaten the result without being told what was in it. She looked at the recipe and looked at Dora and said thank you, and Dora said she didn't want to keep answering questions about the biscuits indirectly. That was the extent of it, but it was the beginning of something that, by the 4th year, had become its own working friendship, built on the shared language of 2 women who understood that feeding people well was not a small thing. Margaret Holt had evolved, over the years, from an adversary to something that couldn't quite be called a friend, but occupied a useful middle space. A woman who understood the county's social architecture, and who had decided somewhere around the time of the hearing that Abigail Mercer was someone worth knowing. They were frank with each other in a way that was more comfortable than warmth. They disagreed about things regularly. Margaret still wore expensive hats. Clara remained the closest thing Abigail had to a genuine friend in the county, and their friendship was the straightforward kind between 2 practical women who respected each other's judgment and were honest when they disagreed. Clara came to the Harvest Festival every year and brought her husband and ate cornbread and talked about things that mattered without dressing them up as things that didn't. Ruth Garner, in Wichita, sent a letter twice a year. They were business-like letters, not personal, but they were consistent, and consistency from Ruth Garner meant something. She had been promoted at the land records firm. She had moved to a better part of the city. The letters mentioned her children occasionally, in the brief, factual way of someone reporting that the important things were being taken care of. Abigail wrote back every time, in the same business-like register, and always included one line that had nothing to do with business, because she thought Ruth had earned at least that much acknowledgement of the cost she'd paid. Victor Hawthorne left the county in the 4th year. He didn't leave dramatically. He sold his primary holding to a cattle consortium from the east and moved to a city that Abigail heard mentioned but couldn't have found on a map. And the nature of his departure, quiet, without announcement, said everything about how thoroughly the investigation had changed his position. The Hawthorne Crossing Ranch became something else under new ownership, ran under different management, hired different men, and within 2 seasons had integrated into the county's economy as simply another operation without the particular gravitational field that Hawthorne had maintained around himself for years. Commissioner Aldrich retired. The county surveyor's position was permanently filled by a man with no prior relationship to any of the major landowners, which was how it should have been for a long time. Slade, the lawyer, relocated his practice to another county, which was a practical rather than a principled decision, but had the same effect. The 3 small ranchers who had been leveraged by the water corridor situation survived, though not easily. One of them sold within 2 years of the investigation's conclusion, not to Hawthorne, who was no longer in a position to buy, but to his own son-in-law, which kept the land in a family that understood it. Haskell continued to operate his reduced holding with the quiet competence that had always characterized him, and his son Thomas built something of his own eventually, a decade on, using what he'd learned at the Mercer operation as the foundation. The western boundary fence was never cut again after the investigation's conclusion. Whether this was because Hawthorne's departure removed the motive, or because whoever had been organizing the cutting understood that the documentation now existed to trace it, Abigail never knew for certain. It didn't matter. It held. The Harvest Festival became a tradition, not a grand one, Abigail was too practical for grand, but a consistent one, the kind of tradition that accumulates meaning not from any single year, but from the fact of it happening again and again, from people knowing it will happen and planning for it and showing up. Every year she made cornbread. Every year it went fast. One year, maybe the 5th or the 6th, she had begun to lose precise track of the years in the way you do when the years are good, or at least steady. Jesse asked her why she always made the same thing. He said it not as a criticism, but as the genuine question of a young man who was curious about the reasons behind decisions. She thought about it. "My mother made it," she said, "when I was small. We didn't have much, but we always had cornmeal, and she made it like it was the best thing she knew how to make. Which I think it was." Jesse nodded slowly. "Is that why?" "Partly." She looked at the pan cooling on the rack. "Partly because the people here are good people, and they're working hard, and they don't need to be impressed. They just need to eat something that's real." He thought about that for a moment in the way he thought about things, genuinely and without hurry. Then, "That's good," he said. "That's a good reason." "Go help Walsh with the chairs," she told him. He went. She stood at the counter for a moment after he left, in the kitchen that was hers now in a way it had taken years to become. Not because Dora had conceded it, but because they'd arrived at a working arrangement that had its own logic and its own ease. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the festival beginning, voices, horses, the particular quality of noise that means people are arriving and are glad to be somewhere. She thought about a woman on a stagecoach with $31 in her coat and the particular kind of nerve that comes not from confidence, but from the absence of alternatives. She thought about picking a paper off the ground while men looked away. She thought about a second ledger behind a flower jar, and a county seat reading room with bad light, and Ruth Garner's level, unbothered voice in a hearing room, and Walsh buying pie without telling anyone, and Cole's hand on her arm for 2 seconds on a narrowing road in April. She thought about all the things she had not known how to do when she arrived, and had learned by doing them badly first, and then doing them better. The root cellar. The conversation with Dills. The dozen decisions she'd made too fast or too slow, or in the wrong order that she'd had to correct after the fact. She thought about her father's voice, which she could still hear sometimes in the quality of silence just before dawn. Pay attention. Work the ground you have. Don't look too far ahead of the work in front of you. She had paid attention. She had worked the ground she had. She had not looked too far ahead when the work in front of her was the thing that needed doing. And here was the ground, 14 acres of it visible from the kitchen window, with the autumn grass going gold and the fence lines straight and the cattle in the south pasture and the water in the eastern fork moving the way water moves, indifferent and constant, regardless of who had tried to claim it, She was 36 years old. She was not who she had expected to be at 36, because she had not expected any of the specific things that had made her who she was. She was harder in some ways and less defended in others, which was how life tended to work when you let it do its job. She was not finished. She had not arrived anywhere that could be called an ending. The ranch would continue to require things from her, would require things from both of them, that she could not predict or prepare for. That was not a comforting thought. She had never been much interested in comfort as an end in itself. What she was interested in was this: the work that was worth doing, done as well as she could do it, with the people who had proven themselves willing to do it alongside her. That was the thing she'd come looking for when she stepped onto a stagecoach with $31 and a letter from a man she'd never met, though she wouldn't have had the words for it then. You don't know what you're building when you start. You only know what you have the capacity for, and whether you're willing to find out where that capacity ends. She picked up the cornbread and carried it outside. Cole was in the yard, talking to Haskell and Thomas, and a couple of men from the northeast section, the easy conversation of people who have worked together long enough that they don't have to perform anything for each other. He saw her come out and move slightly, making room in the group in the way he'd developed of including her without making it a gesture. She set the cornbread on the table. Jesse appeared from somewhere and said something that made Thomas laugh. Walsh stood at the far edge of the yard with a plate and his characteristic expression of a man who had decided to tolerate the social dimension of the afternoon because the food was adequate. Margaret Holt arrived in her best hat, and Frank trailed her with the pleasant expression of a man who has made a lifelong peace with his circumstances. Claire came with her husband and two of her children and found Abigail immediately and started telling her something about the county commission that Abigail needed to hear. The afternoon moved. The light changed. The cornbread went. This was not a triumph. It was not a victory celebration or the end of a battle. It was a Tuesday in September with people in a yard and food on a table and the ordinary accumulation of a life that had been built out of specific choices made under pressure, some of them right and some of them wrong, and all of them made by a woman who understood, by now, that there is no clean arrival at the life you're trying to build. There is only the building and the people you do it with, and whether you have the honesty to see clearly and the stubbornness to keep working when the seeing is hard. Abigail Mercer stood in the yard of the ranch she had fought for and looked at the people she had earned the right to stand among, and she felt something that was not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for it, too light, but something closer to the satisfaction of a woman who has looked at her own life directly and found that it held up. The fence lines held, the wheat came back, and every year the cornbread went first.